Stop pretending, Mom. Just give it back. Ethan's voice cut through the dinner table with a sharpness I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, and for a moment, the clink of silverware and the low hum of the dishwasher seemed to disappear completely, leaving only that sentence hanging in the air like something heavy and final. I looked up from my plate slowly, my hand still resting beside the fork I hadn't touched in several minutes, trying to understand how we had arrived at this exact moment, at this accusation, at this version of my son who was staring at me not with confusion, but with certainty, and across from him, Rachel sat perfectly still, her eyes lowered but her silence louder than anything she could have said, as if she had already decided where she stood, and there was no need to argue it. The overhead light cast a soft glow over the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, where Ethan used to sit with his homework spread out and ask me questions about things I didn't always understand but tried to explain anyway. And yet now it felt like a place I was only passing through, like I had no right to be there at all. I swallowed carefully, feeling the dryness in my throat, and forced my voice to stay steady even though something inside me had already begun to tighten. I don't know what you're talking about, honey, I said, not because I wanted to defend myself, but because I truly didn't understand. Not yet, not fully. And Ethan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it, only frustration. My watch, Mom. The Rolex. It was on my workbench this afternoon, and now it's gone, he said, each word deliberate, as if laying out evidence in a case that had already been decided, and I felt a flicker of recognition then, a small memory rising quietly to the surface. But before I could reach for it, Rachel shifted in her seat and spoke for the first time, her voice calm but edged with something colder. We've talked about this before, Margaret, about going through our things. And there it was, not just an accusation, but a pattern they believed in, a version of me they had already built piece by piece without ever asking if it was true. I lowered my gaze for a moment, looking at the faint scratches on the wooden table, remembering when Ethan and I had picked it out together years ago, back when he still asked for my opinion on things, back when my presence felt like something welcome instead of tolerated. And I realized then how quiet the room had become again, how both of them were waiting, not for an explanation, but for a confession. I could feel it in the way Ethan's shoulders were set, in the way Rachel didn't even look at me anymore, as if the outcome was already decided and this was just a formality. And something in me understood that arguing would only make it worse, that raising my voice or defending myself would confirm the version of me they had already accepted. So instead, I pushed my chair back slowly, the soft scrape against the floor louder than I intended, and stood up without another word. I carried my plate to the sink, rinsing it under warm water, focusing on the simple, familiar motion, because it was easier than turning around and seeing the doubt in my son's eyes. Easier than trying to explain something I hadn't yet put into words myself. And behind me, I could feel them watching, waiting for something more, something louder, something that would justify what they already believed. But I gave them nothing, just the quiet rhythm of water against ceramic, just the steady movement of my hands as if this were any other evening, any other dinner, any other life, because the truth, whatever it was, would still be there in the morning, and for now, silence was the only thing I had left that still belonged to me. I stood at the sink longer than necessary, letting the warm water run over my hands even after the plate was already clean, watching the steam rise slowly and fade into the air as if it had somewhere better to go. Unlike me, because lately I had begun to understand that there were places in this house that no longer belonged to me, even if no one had said it out loud. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above me, a sound I had learned to ignore years ago, back when I still believed small discomforts were just part of keeping a home together. Back when I thought if I kept everything running smoothly, everyone inside it would feel the same sense of care that I put into it. But now I was not so sure. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's chair scrape slightly as he stood, then the low murmur of his voice as he said something to Rachel, too quiet for me to make out, though I could feel the shape of it, the certainty, the assumption that the problem had already been identified and it was simply a matter of addressing it. And I realized with a strange, distant clarity that I was no longer part of the conversation even when it was about me. I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly on a towel that still smelled faintly of lavender, folding it neatly over the rack the way I always did. the way I had done for years without thinking, because routines had a way of grounding you when everything else felt uncertain. And as I moved around the kitchen, putting things back into their places, I could feel their eyes on me less and less. As if once I stopped speaking, I stopped existing in the same way, fading into the background like a piece of furniture that had always been there, but no one really noticed anymore. Earlier that afternoon, I had been in the garage for only a few minutes, just long enough to set down a box of old linens I had been meaning to sort through. And I remembered seeing the watch then, resting too close to the edge of the workbench, catching the light in a way that made it look almost fragile despite its weight and cost. And I had paused, just for a second, thinking about how easily something like that could be scratched or knocked to the floor, especially with all the tools scattered around. And without really thinking much beyond that, I had picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands, noticing how cold the metal felt against my skin, how precise it was, how different from the simple things I had grown used to. And I had carried it inside, not as an act of intrusion, not as something secretive, but simply because it seemed like the right thing to do in that moment, the kind of small, quiet protection that had defined most of my life as a mother. I opened the cabinet where we kept the first aid kit, the one I had organized myself years ago with labeled compartments and neatly folded gauze, and I had wrapped the watch gently in a soft cloth, placing it inside where it would be safe from dust, from tools, from accidents, telling myself I would mention it to Ethan later when he was not busy, when he was not distracted, when there was a moment that felt right. But moments like that had become harder to find, slipping past unnoticed until they were gone. Now, standing in the kitchen with the echo of his accusation still lingering in the air, I realized how easily that small decision had turned into something else entirely, something twisted into suspicion, into disappointment, into a version of me that I did not recognize, but that they seemed to accept without question. And I wondered, not for the first time, when exactly the distance had started, when the simple acts of care had begun to look like interference, when being present had started to feel like overstepping. And as I turned off the light and left the kitchen behind, I carried that question with me, knowing that the answer was somewhere in the quiet spaces between us, waiting to be seen, even if no one was looking for it. I did not sleep much that night, not because of the accusation itself, but because of how easily it had been said, how naturally it had fit into the space between us as if it had been waiting there all along. And I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the hallway clock, counting each second as it passed like a reminder that time does not stop for understanding. It simply moves forward whether you are ready or not. Sometime after midnight, I heard Ethan walking down the hallway, his footsteps slower than usual, pausing once outside my door as if he might knock, but then continuing on without a sound. And I closed my eyes, not wanting him to see me awake, not wanting to force a conversation that neither of us seemed prepared to have, because I had learned over the years that some things cannot be explained in the moment they happen. They have to unfold on their own, quietly, without pressure. The next morning, the house felt different in that subtle way you only notice when you have lived somewhere long enough to recognize its moods, the kind of silence that is not peaceful but careful, like everyone is stepping around something fragile that might break if touched too directly. And I moved through my routine the same way I always did, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the early sunlight stretch across the living room floor. But there was a distance in everything, even in the way the light fell, as if it no longer belonged to me in quite the same way. Ethan came into the kitchen a little after 8, his hair still slightly damp, his expression tight, and he did not look at me right away, instead going straight to the counter, picking up his phone, setting it down again, then opening a drawer only to close it without taking anything out. And I watched him from the corner of my eye, recognizing that restless movement, the way he used to pace when he was younger and trying to solve a problem he could not quite understand. And for a brief moment, I saw the boy he had been layered beneath the man he had become. But the moment passed quickly, replaced again by the tension that had settled between us. "I am going to look again," he said finally, his voice more controlled than the night before, but still carrying that same edge of frustration, and I nodded slightly. Not because he needed my permission, but because it seemed like the only response that would not add more weight to the situation. And he began moving through the house, checking places he had likely already checked, opening cabinets, pulling out drawers, each movement a little sharper than necessary, as if the act of searching itself might force the answer to appear. Rachel joined him a few minutes later, her voice low as she asked if he had tried the garage again, suggesting places with a calmness that felt practiced. And together they retraced steps that I already knew would lead them nowhere until they reached the one place they had not considered, the one place that had never been part of their assumption because it did not fit the story they had already decided to believe. I remained at the table, my hands wrapped loosely around my coffee mug, letting it grow cold without noticing, because there was a strange stillness settling inside me now, not resignation exactly, but something quieter, something steadier. The understanding that the truth does not need to defend itself, it simply waits. And as I listened to the soft echo of cabinet doors opening and closing down the hallway, I found myself remembering all the times I had done the same for him when he was younger, searching for lost things, school papers, keys, small objects that seemed important enough to cause panic until they were found again, and I had never once questioned him, never once assumed carelessness or blame. I had simply helped. Because that is what you do when you love someone. You fill in the gaps without asking why they exist. Now, as the sound of their search moved closer to the kitchen again, I could feel something shifting, something approaching the surface, and I knew that sooner or later, they would reach the cabinet by the wall, the one that held the first aid kit, the one place I had not mentioned, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because the moment to explain it had never come, and perhaps, in some quiet way, I had been waiting to see whether they would find it on their own, whether they would discover the truth without being led to it, and what that discovery might reveal. Not about the watch, but about us. I heard the cabinet door open before I saw anything, a soft click against the wall that carried farther than it should have in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, and I did not turn my head right away, not because I did not know what it meant, but because I wanted to give that moment space to unfold on its own, the way truth often does when it is no longer being pushed aside. There was a pause, just a second or two, and then another sound, lighter this time, the shifting of something small, being moved, followed by silence that stretched longer than before, heavy and uncertain, and I could feel it even from where I sat at the table, the way the air seemed to hold its breath as if waiting to see what would happen next. I set my cup down carefully, the porcelain touching the wood with a soft, controlled sound, and finally turned just enough to see Ethan standing by the cabinet, the first aid kit open in his hands, his shoulders no longer tense in the same way, but still, almost frozen, as if he had stepped into a moment he had not prepared for. Rachel stood a few steps behind him, her arms folded loosely, her expression unreadable, though there was a slight shift in her posture, a hesitation that had not been there before, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Because sometimes there are things that do not need to be said immediately, things that arrive fully formed the second they are seen. Ethan reached into the kit slowly, his movements no longer sharp or impatient, but careful, almost cautious, and when he pulled his hand back, the watch was there, resting in his palm, wrapped in the same soft cloth I had used the day before, the edges tucked in neatly, the way I had done so many times with fragile things that mattered to him. Though he had never noticed before, or perhaps had never needed to. He stared at it for a long second, then another, turning it slightly so the light caught the metal, the same way I had when I first picked it up, and I could see the shift happen, not all at once, but gradually, like something inside him recalibrating, moving from certainty to confusion, from confusion to understanding, and finally to something quieter, something heavier. I found it, he said, though the words felt unnecessary, because we could all see it, because the truth was already there in the open, no longer hidden, no longer shaped by assumption, just existing exactly as it was, simple and undeniable. I did not respond right away, not because I wanted to make a point, but because there was nothing I needed to add to what he was already seeing, and I watched as he unfolded the cloth, revealing the watch in perfect condition, untouched, protected, and for a brief moment, I saw his reflection in its surface, small and distorted, like he was looking at a version of himself he had not expected to find. Rachel stepped closer then, her gaze fixed on the watch, then flicking briefly toward me, and there was something different in that glance, not quite an apology, not yet, but no longer the same quiet certainty as before, more like a question she had not thought to ask until now. Ethan closed his hand around the watch again, not tightly, but firmly, as if grounding himself in something real, and he exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more than just relief, something deeper, something that had been building since the night before without him fully recognizing it. I remained where I was, my hands resting calmly in my lap, feeling the stillness settle around us again. But this time it was not the same kind of silence, not careful or fragile, but something clearer, something that had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And as Ethan finally lifted his eyes to look at me, really look this time, I could see it there, not just the realization of where the watch had been, but the weight of everything that had come with it, everything that had been said, and everything that had not been questioned before it was believed. For a few seconds, no one moved, and in that stillness, I could almost hear the quiet unraveling of everything that had been assumed the night before. The way certainty gives way when it meets something undeniable, and Ethan stood there with the watch in his hand as if it weighed more than it should, not because of its price, but because of what it now represented, and I watched him carefully, not searching for an apology, not expecting anything immediate, but simply observing the way his expression shifted, the way his eyes lingered on the cloth, on the careful folds, on the small details he might never have noticed before, and I wondered if he could see it now, not just the object, but the intention behind it, the quiet habit of taking care, of noticing things that might go overlooked. He finally stepped closer to the table, his movements slower than before, and placed the watch down gently, almost deliberately, as if he was trying to return it to something more than just a surface. And when he spoke, his voice had lost the edge it carried the night before, replaced by something less certain, something searching. "You put it there," he said, not as an accusation this time, but as a realization forming in real time, and I nodded once, a small, simple gesture, because there was no need to explain beyond that, no need to fill the space with words that would only circle around what was already clear. Rachel shifted again, her arms unfolding slightly, her posture no longer as closed off, and she glanced between us as if trying to measure the distance that had suddenly changed shape, and I could sense that. She was waiting, perhaps for me to say something more, to justify, to defend, to clarify, but I remained quiet, not out of stubbornness, but because silence had a way of letting people hear themselves more clearly. Ethan picked up the cloth again, smoothing it between his fingers, and there was a moment where he seemed to hesitate, as if replaying something in his mind, the conversation from the night before, the tone he had used, the certainty he had carried, and I saw it then, the flicker of recognition that went beyond the missing watch, something deeper, something more personal, and it stayed with him longer than I expected. "I thought," he began, then stopped, the sentence falling away before it could take shape, and I could tell he was searching for the right words, the kind that would bridge the gap that had opened between us. But words are not always enough, especially when what needs to be understood is not just what was said, but what was assumed without question. I folded my hands together loosely on the table, feeling the calm settle more firmly now, not because the situation had resolved, but because the truth had surfaced, and that alone changes the weight of everything that comes after. And I spoke then, my voice steady, not cold, not warm, just clear. "It was too close to the edge in the garage," I said, keeping my eyes on him, not looking away. "I did not want it to get scratched while you were working." And I left it at that. No added explanation, no reminder of anything else, because the simplicity of it was enough, and I watched as he absorbed those words, not quickly, not easily, but gradually, as if each part had to find its place inside him before it made sense. Rachel looked down at the table then, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface, and there was a quiet shift in the room, something subtle but undeniable, as if the roles had adjusted without anyone announcing it. And Ethan exhaled again, longer this time, setting the watch back down carefully, and for the first time since the night before, he met my eyes without that same certainty, without that same distance, and in its place was something else, something more complicated, something that could not be resolved in a single sentence. And I realized then that this moment was not about the watch at all, not really. It was about everything that had been building quietly over time, every assumption, every unspoken thought, every time care had been mistaken for interference. And as we sat there in that shared silence, I understood that while the truth had been found, what it revealed would take much longer to fully understand. The room did not return to normal after that, not in the way people expect when a problem is solved, because some things do not settle back into place once they have been disturbed. They shift instead, quietly, permanently, and I could feel that shift in the way Ethan remained standing there a moment longer than necessary, his hand still resting near the watch, as if he was unsure whether to pick it up again or leave it where it was. And Rachel moved toward the counter, not speaking, not offering any explanation or reaction, but her silence now felt different, less certain, more aware, as though she too had stepped into something she had not fully considered before. I stood up slowly, not to leave, but to continue the small routines that had always defined my place in this house. Reaching for the dish towel, adjusting a chair that was slightly out of line, actions that did not require acknowledgement, because I understood that whatever needed to happen next would not come from me forcing it. It would come from them recognizing it on their own, and recognition, when it is real, does not arrive quickly. It builds, layer by layer, until it can no longer be ignored. Ethan finally picked up the watch, this time with a different kind of care, not the hurried grip from before, but something more deliberate, and he looked at it again, turning it in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Though it was not the watch itself he was trying to understand, it was everything surrounding it, everything that had led to that moment at the table the night before, and I could see the questions forming behind his eyes, not directed at me, but at himself, at the assumptions he had made without hesitation, at the ease with which he had believed something about me that was not true. I should have checked more carefully, he said finally, the words quiet, almost uncertain, and I did not respond immediately, not because I wanted him to feel the weight of it, but because I wanted him to hear what he had just said, to understand that it was not just about checking a room or a drawer, it was about the way he had chosen to see me in that moment, and whether that choice had come from something deeper than a missing object. I walked past him then, not brushing against him, not avoiding him, just moving through the space as I always had, and for a brief second, I felt his gaze follow me, not in accusation this time, but in something closer to reflection, as if he was trying to reconcile the version of me he had spoken to the night before with the person standing in front of him now, and I wondered if he could see the difference, or if the difference had always been there, unnoticed. Rachel cleared her throat softly, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and she spoke without looking directly at me. It was just confusing, she said, her voice measured, careful, as though she was choosing each word with precision, and I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. Because confusion is not the same as conclusion, and yet somehow it had led to one all the same. Ethan set the watch down again, this time closer to himself, not as something to protect from the environment, but as something to hold on to while he worked through what remained unsaid, and the room settled into a different kind of quiet, not the strained silence from before, but one filled with unspoken realization, the kind that does not demand immediate resolution, only acknowledgement. I returned to the table and sat down once more, folding my hands gently in front of me, feeling the calm return in a deeper way now, not because everything had been resolved, but because the truth had changed the direction of what would come next. And as I looked at Ethan, really looked at him the way I had when he was younger, trying to understand something difficult, I saw it there again, that hesitation, that pause before speaking, and I knew that whatever he said next would matter, not because it would fix what had happened, but because it would show whether he had truly seen what had been in front of him all along, or if he would simply move past it, leaving the deeper question unanswered. The silence stretched just a little too long, not uncomfortable in the usual way, but heavy with something that could no longer be ignored, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, as if the floor beneath him had changed without warning, his fingers brushing against the edge of the table before pulling back again, uncertain, and I watched him carefully, not expecting perfection, not expecting immediate understanding, but waiting to see whether he would step into the space that had opened between us or retreat from it as if it had never been there at all. He took a slow breath, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have reached a point they cannot simply walk away from. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of certainty, stripped of assumption. "I should not have said that to you," he said, And the words hung in the air, not dramatic, not forced, but real in a way that could not be undone once spoken, and I felt something shift. Inside me, not relief exactly, but recognition, because acknowledgement is different from apology. It carries weight in a way that cannot be dismissed. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to understand that I had heard him, but I did not rush to respond, because there are times when silence allows the truth to settle more deeply than any immediate answer ever could, and I could see that he was still working through it, still piecing together not just what had happened, but why it had happened the way it did. Rachel moved slightly closer to him then, her presence quieter now, less certain than before, and she rested her hand lightly on the back of the chair, not sitting, not leaving, simply remaining there as if she was trying to find her place in a situation that had shifted beyond her expectations. And for a brief moment, I saw the flicker of something in her expression, something that looked almost like reconsideration, though it passed quickly, replaced again by composure. Ethan glanced down at the watch again, then back at me, and there was something different in his eyes now, not just guilt, but a kind of searching, as if he was trying to understand how he had missed something that, in hindsight, seemed so simple, and I recognized that feeling. Because life has a way of revealing things only after you have already made a mistake, not before. I just assumed, he started, then stopped, the sentence unfinished, but the meaning clear, and I nodded slightly, not to agree, but to acknowledge the truth in what he had not fully said, because assumptions rarely need to be explained. They show themselves in the way people act, in the way they choose to believe one version of a story over another without pausing to ask why. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands loosely, and spoke in a calm, even tone. "You did not ask," I said, not accusing, not raising my voice. Just stating something that had been there from the beginning, simple and undeniable, and I watched as those words reached him in a different way than anything else had, because they did not challenge him. They did not demand anything. They simply revealed the gap between what had happened and what could have happened instead. He lowered his eyes for a moment, absorbing that, and I could see the weight of it settle, not heavily, but steadily, like something that would remain with him long after. This moment passed, and Rachel looked at him then, her expression softer, more uncertain, as if she was also beginning to see that the situation had never been as clear as it had seemed. The house felt quieter now, but not in the same fragile way as before. It was a quieter that came from something being understood, even if not fully resolved, and I stood up slowly, not to leave the conversation, but to return to the rhythm of the day, because life does not pause for clarity, it continues, and it is within that continuation that understanding either deepens or fades. As I moved past Ethan, he shifted slightly, making space for me without thinking, a small gesture, almost unconscious, but different from before, and I noticed it, not because it was significant on its own, but because it suggested something had changed in the way he saw me, even if he had not yet found the words to express it. And as I walked toward the window, letting the light fall across the room once more, I realized that this moment, quiet as it was, would not be forgotten, not because of the watch, but because of everything it had revealed about what we had become, and what we might still have the chance to be if we chose to see each other clearly. The morning moved forward in small, quiet increments, the kind that do not announce themselves, but slowly reshape the space they pass through, and I found myself standing by the window longer than I needed to, watching the light stretch across the yard, tracing the same familiar lines it had followed for years. Yet somehow it felt different now, as if the house itself had shifted in a way that could not be measured but could still be felt. Behind me, I could hear Ethan moving again, not with the same restless urgency as before, but more carefully, more aware of each step. And there was something in that change that stayed with me, because it was not just about the watch anymore. It was about the space between us, the way it had been filled with assumptions instead of questions, and how easily that had happened without either of us stopping to notice. He cleared his throat softly, not as a way to interrupt, but as if testing whether the moment was ready for something more. And when I turned slightly, I saw that he was still holding the watch, though now it rested more loosely in his hand, not gripped, not guarded, just there, present but no longer. "The center of everything, Mom," he said, and the word itself carried a different weight this time, not sharp, not distant, but careful, like something he was relearning how to say, and I met his gaze without hesitation, not waiting, not pushing, just allowing the moment to exist as it was. He hesitated for a second, then stepped a little closer, closing the distance that had felt so wide the night before. And I could see the effort in that movement, the decision behind it, because understanding does not happen all at once. It requires a choice, and he was beginning to make it. I did not even think to ask, he admitted, his voice steady but quieter than before, and I nodded slightly, not to agree or disagree, but to acknowledge that he had reached that realization on his own, because that is the only way it ever truly matters. Rachel shifted again near the counter, her posture no longer rigid, her arms no longer folded, and she looked toward me briefly before looking away, as if she was unsure whether to step into the conversation or remain at its edge. And I could sense that she was reconsidering something as well, something that had once felt obvious but no longer did. Ethan placed the watch down on the table again, but this time he did not let go immediately, his fingers lingering on it as if it had become a reminder of something larger, something that could not simply be set aside. And he exhaled slowly, the sound soft but deliberate. "You were just trying to take care of it," he said, more to himself than to me. And I watched as that understanding settled into him. Not quickly, not completely, but enough to begin changing the way he saw what had happened. I stepped back from the window then, returning to the table, not because I needed to be closer, but because it felt right to meet him there, in that shared space where things had shifted. And I rested my hands lightly against the back of the chair, feeling the solid wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something familiar. "I have always tried to take care of the things that matter to you," I said quietly, not as a defense, not as a correction, but simply as a truth that had never needed to be spoken before. And I let the words remain simple, unadorned, because anything more would have taken away from what they already held. Ethan looked up at me then, really looked, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not just regret, but recognition, the kind that does not fade once it has taken hold. And I could see that he was beginning to understand not just this moment, but the pattern behind it, the small ways in which care can be misunderstood when it is no longer expected, when it is seen as intrusion instead of protection. Rachel took a small step forward then, her voice softer than before. "We did not mean to," she began, but the sentence trailed off, unfinished, and I gave her a slight nod, not to accept an apology that had not fully formed, but to acknowledge the attempt, because sometimes that is all that can be offered in the beginning. The room settled again, but this time it felt clearer, less burdened, as if something had been brought into the open that could no longer be hidden behind assumptions. And as I looked at both of them, I realized that this moment, quiet as it was, had shifted something essential, not erased what had happened, but changed the direction of what might come next. And that, in its own quiet way, mattered more than anything else that could have been said. The rest of the morning passed without any raised voices, without any attempt to force the moment into something it was not ready to become. And in that quiet continuation, I found a kind of clarity that had been missing before, not because everything had been resolved, but because something important had finally been seen, and once something is seen clearly, it cannot return to being ignored. Ethan remained in the kitchen longer than usual, moving slowly, deliberately, as if each action required more thought than it once had, and I noticed the way he set his watch down carefully on the counter, not near the edge this time, not among scattered tools or loose papers, but in a space that felt intentional, as though he had learned something from the smallest detail without needing it to be explained again. Rachel began clearing a few things from the table, her movements quieter, more measured, and she glanced toward me once or twice, not with the same certainty she had carried before, but with something closer to awareness, as if she was beginning to understand that there are layers to a person that cannot be judged in a single moment. And I acknowledged those glances with the same calm presence I had held all along, because there was no need to draw attention to the change for it to matter. I moved through the house, as I always did, straightening a cushion, adjusting the curtains, letting the rhythm of familiar tasks guide me forward. And yet there was a difference now, subtle but steady, like a shift in balance that could not be reversed. And I felt it most clearly in the way Ethan finally spoke again, not from across the room, not with distance, but from closer, from a place that required him to stand in what had happened rather than step around it. I was wrong, he said, simply, without decoration, without excuse. And I turned to face him fully, taking in the expression on his face, the absence of defensiveness, the presence of something quieter and more honest. And I recognized that this was not just about correcting a mistake. It was about acknowledging the way that mistake had come so easily in the first place. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to understand that I had heard him, and then I nodded once. Not as forgiveness offered quickly, not as something to erase what had been said, but as a recognition that he had taken a step he had not taken before. I know, I said, my voice steady, not cold, not warm, just clear, because the truth does not need to be softened to be understood. Rachel paused beside the table then, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, and for a brief moment, she looked as though she might speak, might add something to what had already been said, but instead she remained quiet. And I understood that silence, too, can be a form of acknowledgement, especially when words are not yet ready to carry the full weight of what has changed. Ethan picked up the watch again, turning it once in his hand before fastening it around his wrist, the movement. Slow, deliberate, as if marking a moment that would stay with him long after this day had passed. And when he lowered his arm, there was a subtle shift in the way he stood, not dramatic, not immediate, but enough to suggest that something inside him had adjusted, something that would influence the way he saw me, the way he chose to respond the next time uncertainty appeared. I stepped past him then, moving toward the hallway, not because I wanted to leave, but because life does not pause for reflection. It continues, and it is within that continuation that understanding either deepens or fades. And as I reached the doorway, I paused just long enough to say what needed to be said, not more, not less. I was only trying to protect what matters to you. And I did not wait for a response, because the words were not meant to start another conversation. They were meant to settle into the space that had opened between us, to remain there as something steady and true. I continued down the hallway at the same measured pace, feeling the quiet of the house shift once more behind me, not empty, not tense, but changed in a way that would reveal itself over time. And as I moved forward, I understood that moments like this do not end with a single apology or a single realization. They continue in the choices that follow, in the questions that are asked instead of assumed, in the care that is recognized instead of misunderstood, and whether or not those changes would take root was not something I could control, but I had seen enough to know that something had begun, something quiet, something real, and sometimes that is enough.